Hey queer friends, are you ready to be inspired? Welcome to Season 5 of Coming Out and Beyond, a podcast that shares stories from the LGBTQIA+ community. Here's your host, Anne-Marie Zanzel.
Hi, this is Anne-Marie Zanzel, and welcome back to another episode of Coming Out and Beyond, LGBTQIA+ stories. And I'm so excited to welcome to the show today author Tate Barkley. Tate is a native of Statesville, North Carolina, and he struggled with feelings of shame, of living in poverty, of alcoholism and addiction, and of being a closeted gay man. With more than 20 years in recovery, Tate uses his journey to write and speak about shame, self-acceptance, mental wellness, resilience, personal integrity, and ethics. Tate is a practicing attorney, speaker, author, and educator living in Houston, Texas, with his husband of 6 years, Anson, and their dog, Emerson. Tate is the author of Sunday Dinners, Moonshine and Men. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Anne-Marie. I'm excited to be here.
I am excited to talk to you. I love talking to authors. That's probably one of my most favorite things to do. And so it sounds like your book is a little autobiographical. Is that true?
It is. That's right.
All right.
People ask me if it's a memoir, and I say, well, it's a memoir about my relationship with my dad, who was a very impactful person, in my life. So in our lives, our drinking, my struggle with being gay is kind of the wrestling match that goes on through so much of that book. And anyway, so yeah, it's a tale of two men struggling with a lot of the same things.
Mm-hmm. So my first question I ask, and this is, my goodness, a loaded one for you, is tell me your story, Tate.
Oh my goodness. Well, it's like, there's a 3-minute version and a 3.5-hour version. So how about the 3-minute version?
How about a 10-minute version?
Okay. Well, it's like you shared with our audience earlier that I was born in Statesville, North Carolina, and really outside of Statesville in what I call rural North Carolina. And so it was a very conservative place, as you might imagine. And I came to life and grew up in a very conservative town.
Can I ask you whereabouts Statesville is? Like, I sort of know North Carolina, so where about in the state is it?
If you go 42 miles north of Charlotte on Interstate 77, you'll find Statesville. It's right there.
Okay, so it's pretty much very in the middle of.
You bet. It is Bible Belt, and my grandmothers would let you know it. So
my ex-wife's partner comes from North Carolina in the same sort of area. So not my ex-wife, my wife's ex-partner. I'll have to scratch that one.
Yeah, scratch that out. That's an edit.
Her ex-partner came from that same kind of area, and I know a lot about that.
I was born in 1965, so I began, our life centered really around the church. Whenever I was little, it was family and church, and that's just how things went. And a week was, you not only went to Sunday school on Sunday and church services, but you stayed after church, for the covered dish social. You always had prayer meeting on Wednesday night, and of course, you always were calling on somebody who was sick or whatever. My grandmothers were very devoted to the church, but their view of the religion was I call it's very Old Testament in its approach to things. And I learned at a very early age, when I saw how people were viewed, that you were your sin. Whatever that sin was, that's what you were. And it seemed like so much of the mercifulness and forgiveness that's talked about by Jesus, didn't seem to make it to the pulpits where I grew up. So,
were you a Southern Baptist?
No, I was not a Southern Baptist. I was ARP Presbyterian, which was a little Southern branch of Presbyterian that broke off from the main church. Well, because they didn't like the way, they didn't want to change the hymns, and they didn't like how progressive they were becoming in the early 40s. So they broke off into the Southern denomination of that. So it's primarily that. And one grandmother was Lutheran and the other one was Presbyterian.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So they also that they didn't know the New Testament was written.
I'll tell you what, you didn't hear a lot about it, but I'll tell you what, you got a lot of Leviticus, I can tell you that. And so, but I just share that. I mean, I love my grandmothers, don't get me wrong. And I think there's no doubt they loved me. And that's kind of what the Sunday dinners means in the book title, Sunday Dinners, Moonshine and Men. That was my favorite time. I actually liked church until I began to realize that I was different, and the way I was different was considered an abomination. I probably knew, Anne-Marie, 5th, 6th grade, that I was attracted to other guys, and I regularly heard about the abomination that was homosexuality and how that was condemned, and that was pretty much beat into you in those early days. And so I knew that I was different, and I knew that I didn't quite fit into the world that was being presented to me at the time, and it gave me a lot of fear. But the Sunday dinners part, when I was very young, my father is what I call a flim-flam man. He's very charismatic man, very larger than life, but very narcissistic. I love him, think he loved me, but that's just who he was. As a result, he was always chasing some get-rich scheme, and it was very disruptive. So my favorite time was whenever I was safe with mainly my grandmother Kirkman, and she would always take us to church, and we'd have Sunday dinner, and I could help make Sunday dinner. And it was those good Southern Sunday dinners, fried cube steak and gravy and mashed potatoes and green beans with a big old scoop of bacon grease in them, and all that stuff that I loved anyway. And it was a special time because I felt safe with her. And
it makes a lot of sense. I grew up in a very chaotic home. I was Catholic. I was raised Catholic. And church, I liked church. It provided a place of safety for me. I also went to Catholic school. So it provided a place of safety, and my home life was quite chaotic. So when I went to church, I knew what the rules were. I knew what was expected of me. And also I was in school there, and I excelled at school. So I got a lot of praise for that and everything like that. So when I write about church, and I was also sort of a groundbreaker. I was one of the first girls ever as allowed to serve on the altar when I was 10 years old. I always had a bent towards those things. So I understand about how church can play a role for a lot of us, especially those of us who grew up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where it's sort of a place where you would go, and it would provide normalization, because a lot of us grew up with alcoholic parents because of World War II, and so and so that's where we found safety. And so I completely understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, because you and I share that. My father was an alcoholic, and I never knew him any other way, frankly. And he died an alcoholic. So it was chaotic, and church was that safety. And plus, I always really liked the ritual of church, because you would do this, and then you would do, there was structure to it. At home, there was no structure. I never knew when we were going to have to pick up and go. Church had structure, and I loved it. And of course, my grandmothers were there, whichever church I was at the time, they were with me, and I always liked being with them. So, and I think you're right. And fortunately, my dad, I never saw my dad in a church except for at a funeral, ever. He would drop me off at my grandmother's to take me to church, but he would never go. And so one of the reasons we eventually left North Carolina is because my dad said they were small-minded. And he picked us up, and we came to Houston in 1977. And I remember him sitting me on the steps. We had some concrete steps outside our trailer in North Carolina. And he said, Houston's booming, Bob. And I'm telling you, we're going to go to Houston and all dreams can come true there. So we moved yet again. We had already moved about 7 times by then. I was 12. And when I was in 4th grade, I went to 4 different schools. So I did not want to leave, because that summer I had my first kind of, with my best friend, I had my first relationship with a guy, if you could call it that. I mean, we were very young, and I didn't want to leave him. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of heartbreaking for me to leave. But once we got to Houston, man, everything turned upside down. I had never seen a place with so many people, mm-hmm. and they were different. Many of them were different. Even then, I had never seen a Latino except for on TV. And we got to Houston, they were, it was a very multicultural, even way back then, with many ethnicities around. And I was fascinated by it. And I loved it. I loved it. But what followed me around is there were also a lot of incredibly looking guys. And what followed me around was this fact that this repression of who I was. And that's when I picked up my first drink, was in Houston. There was a bayou that ran behind the apartment complex. And one of my buddies handed me a beer one night, Anne Marie, and I drank it. It was one of those Miller High Life, the champagne of beers. And I drank the second one. And by the time I drank the second one, I mean, it was like the whole weight of the world had been lifted off of me. I caught my first beer buzz, and I loved every second of it. And, I chased that same buzz for another 21 years before I got sober.
So when I was in seminary, I did a lot of the work I did in seminary was around addiction. And probably working out my demons for my dad, who, by the way, stopped drinking when I was 18 and did a lot to repair everything, And I read a great book, and it was called Thirst, and it was God and the Alcoholic. It was written by a seminary professor. And what I read, it sounds exactly like what you described as the first time I did cocaine when I was like 19 years old. It was this moment where all of a sudden I felt whole and complete.
Yeah.
And in this book, he talks about that addiction is actually a spiritual disease. And when, and I know, I'm sure you've done a lot of AA and stuff like that, but when it becomes ultimately your addiction becomes your higher power. Mm-hmm. And then you go for the rest of your life, the rest of your relationship with your drug of choice, chasing that first high, because it never feels as good as the first high.
Sure doesn't. Sure doesn't.
Yeah.
And to that point, it was, I remember on that very night, there was a water pipe that ran across this bayou, and I was always too scared to walk across it, thought I'd fall in the water. But that night, I walked across it back, and I mean, here I am buzzing, but I walked back and forth across it, and I felt so courageous and so complete, like you said, so whole, and I felt brave, and I just knew that things would get easier. And then I focused. Once I had experienced that, so much of the rest of my life, I was focused on trying to recapture that high. Yeah. And that was a goal of mine,
Mm-hmm. So, are you in the process of coming out later in life? Are you feeling isolated or lost, cut off from friends and family, or just trying to figure out what is the next step for you? Well, I have a wonderful coaching program called Lotus Group Coaching. It is for people who are female identifying, cis or trans, or non-binary folks comfortable in those spaces. And we provide emotional, spiritual, and intellectual support for people who are in the process of coming out later in life. We discuss many things in our community, but what's most important is that you have a community of others who understand. Each one of the coaches in the program have come out later in life, and everybody who is a member of our program is somewhere in the process. So if you are seeking community and you want a soft place to land, go to my website, amoryzanzel.com, and book a connection call. We would love to talk to you. So, how did this? So, do you now view your addiction as a way for you to suppress your queerness?
My addiction was the way that well, unquestionably, I suppressed my queerness with addiction for most of my adult life. I got sober when I was 33, and I was 29 before I actually came out. And by the time I started gingerly coming out as a gay man, I was so far along in my addiction, in my alcoholism and drug use, that everything was really, really blurred at that point in time. And I had real issues with being gay. I didn't want to be gay. I did not want to be a gay man. I didn't want to be queer because I wanted to be a guy's guy. I wanted to I'll never forget. I remember we were watching a news clip about the San Francisco gay pride parade way back in the late 70s. And I remember my dad just kicking me and saying, "Bubba, I better never." And I knew exactly what he meant by that. He didn't have to complete the sentiment. And I didn't want to be that queer. I didn't want to be that fairy. I didn't want to be that fag. I didn't want to be that person. Sorry for the language, but that was what was in my head. I was so afraid of being labeled that. And as such, I struggled to accept who I was. When I finally started gingerly coming out to a few people, it really wasn't, I hate to say this, but it's the truth. It really wasn't to come out as a proud gay man. It was really because I couldn't repress my sexual urges anymore. And my alcohol was perfect. My addictions were perfect because once I decided that I was going to engage, it made me brave enough to go into the clubs. And, and that was my view of being gay, was going into the clubs and trying to have somebody to have sex with. And then just sort of disappearing in the haze of drunkenness and sex and drug use. When I got sober, Anne-Marie, when the light of day finally hit, and I'm in early sobriety, and I did get sober through AA, and I still in AA and still do the 12 steps. And that same, it hit me that the shame of being gay was still there. So and even as young in the program as I was, I realized that until I could come into acceptance about who I was not going to stay sober, because my addiction was part and parcel of my shame. And my shame about being gay. They were so inextricably linked that I had to kind of deal with them both.
Well, and I find that the women I work with that come out later in their life, they often come out after they're in recovery, because it's when they're in recovery, they're able to deal with the shame that has been fostered, or the guilt, the shame or the guilt that has been fostered on them by society, by religion, by all kinds of things. And then they are able to, to accept themselves as who they are, as who they were beautifully created to be.
and that is so true. And I got talk about, and I was lucky or blessed, or however you want to look at it. When I got sober, I managed to get through University of Texas, Austin, in law school, and passed the Texas bar, and then eventually had my own law practice up in North Texas. My drinking, and it turned out to be a very successful law practice that I subsequently lost due to my drinking. And I found myself broke in, and back at my parents' house when I finally made the decision, after thinking about suicide, to go to Hazelden. I went to Hazelden in Minnesota for treatment. And when I came home, there was nothing. I literally, my dad, whom we've talked about some, he picked me up at the airport drunk when I came back. Classic dad. And he was like, "Oh, well, I sure hope they taught you how to drink, bub. You're not an alcoholic." And I kind of heard that on the ride home. And then when we got to my mom and dad's house, my dad was a practicing alcoholic. And then my sister, one of my baby sisters, said, you can't stay here. I didn't have any other place to go. I was living with my parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I went and lived with my sister, who had only been married for 3 months, to get on my feet and to start recovery. And it was really a blessing. But when I left her house, I was still afraid to be by myself. So I moved in basically in a duplex with my best friend from high school.
Mm-hmm.
And she fortuitously was 3 blocks from the Lambda Center, which was a club devoted to groups in 12-step recovery in the gay community. So I got lucky that way. So as I started literally working through recovery and my alcoholism, I was around other queer people who were doing the same thing, many of whom had accepted themselves as queer, but had still struggled with alcoholism. And I got to start all over again, Anne-Marie, and start learning how to be a grown-up, with these folks. And it was a really, really golden time for me. I was still broke, but I had never, those first 2 or 3 years of sobriety, worked in the program with other queer people who were struggling. We all had our secrets. And, I learned when you hide and when you have secrets, it's like this drip of acid on your essence as a human being, and until you get it out of there and get the secrets out and share them and expose them for what they are, which is bullshit. My shame about being gay was just both, pardon the language, but it's just bullshit. And I had to just work through it, though. Anyway, I could go on and on and on about recovery but for me, coming out and getting sober were the one and the same experience.
What I find very fascinating is that I don't read Jesus. So I'm going to say something heretical. I don't believe Jesus died for my sins. Just never have. But I do think that Jesus's story is a lot like many of the religious teachers of birth, life, death, rebirth.
Right.
And when I heard you said you were 33, it sort of made me smile, because if as a former churchgoer, that was the age of Jesus's death.
Yep.
And I think it's really interesting is that you had to die to a sense of self, of your conditioning, of who your mom and dad, and you haven't mentioned your mother, which I think is really interesting. We can talk about that later. Your mom and your dad told you to be. You had to die to that sense of self, or you could accept who you were created to be.
Yeah, and that is very true. Yeah, there were metrics that were given to me as a young man, and that is, you played football, you went hunting, you of course dated girls, and that's what you had to do. And you didn't cry, you had to fight if you were pissed off and somebody did you wrong. There was that kind of hyper masculine myth that was laid out there for me, in that to conduct myself accordingly. And from a very young age, it made me very uncomfortable. And I never it wasn't until I really started grappling with the fact that I was a gay man that I realized, what it was. And it had been beat in my head that, gay men they're effeminate, they're this, they're that, they're all these things. But that's not been my experience. Our
community is so vast and very
wonderfully diverse.
I know, it's so diverse. Yes, there are people that are flamboyantly lesbian and flamboyantly gay and flamboyantly trans, but there's also people that are just living their lives, and it really has more to do with personality as who they are as people. So it is an incredibly diverse and rich community. And sometimes, my wife has been out since 1985, so we're both 60. She's a year older than me. And she would say that back in the day when she would go to Pensacola, she would go to Pensacola. She's a Southerner too. She grew up in Nashville. that she would go to Pensacola, and she goes, the news crews always looked for the most flamboyantly gay person there to almost perpetuate a stereotype of
Yeah.
what somebody was gay was. And she goes, the funny thing is Pensacola is where the military base is. So half the people there were in the don't ask, don't tell area. And so like nobody wanted to talk to any type of reporter or anything like that. But there, that's often what, heteronormativity does. They find the things that are from most different from them, and that's what they lift up as the example for all. And I love that part of our community. It's one of my favorite parts.
Me too.
But it's very interesting how they do things, and they still do it today. They still do.
You're right, and they still do, and in the stereotypical representations of the queer community, they survive to this day. I think that fortunately, and maybe it's getting a little better, but
Well,
we're
stereotypes are there for a reason.
Yeah.
Because people are like that.
Yeah.
That's why we have stereotypes.
Yeah.
So tell me about your book.
Okay. Well, my book was really I've been asked, why did you write it? And I didn't really start off to write a book, Anne-Marie. My dad died in 2012, and I had what you've learned probably so far, a very complicated and tumultuous relationship with my dad. And I was still dealing with a lot of those issues. And I did not come out to my dad until his final illness. I mean, I carried that with me. And I'm from the recovery tradition. So when something bugs me, you're right. So, and that's what I did. A year after Dad's death, there were things that still bugged me. And so I was writing. And I was rather old school, and I wrote it, and I said, oh my God, I have this chicken scratch. And I said, let me dictate this. So I dictated it, and I gave it to our transcriptionist at work. And it was transcribed, and I just was taking a look at it. I had no intention of doing anything with it other than, trying to write out my feelings. And I looked at it, and I just put it aside for 3 or 4 months because I got busy with work. And then I had a knock on my door, and like I said, about 3 or 4 months later, and the person who had transcribed it, she said, do you have any more dictation for me? And I said, well, about what do you mean? And she says, your book. And I said, what book? And she said, the book you're writing about you and your dad. And I thought, she said, I said, that wasn't really what I was doing. I kind of smiled, and she says, well, I want to know how it ends. So that's got me to thinking. I said, well, maybe I'll just keep writing. And then that's how Sunday Dinners, Moonshine and Men came about. And it chronicles, my life, and of course my relationship with Dad, and really my drinking, and then my struggle with coming out, and then my acceptance later, and then trying to reconcile as best I could, all of this with my dad later. And when I was talking to some folks, they were like, there was a lot of books on coming out and a lot of books on getting sober, but I think we've all had a complicated relationship with a parent, and to sort of mix that in with this relationship, I'd like to think that it gave me an opportunity to maybe do something a little different with those issues, and I'd like to think that we've done it. You mentioned earlier my mom and my,
I didn't even, honestly, I'm going to say, Tate, I didn't know if she was alive or not.
Yeah.
You were talking about your grandmas, you were talking about your dad,
Mm-hmm.
and then you mentioned something about when you moved to Houston that your mother went, and I was like, oh, his mom was still alive. So I'm very curious about that, because where does she fall in all of this?
My mom is, my mom is one of those people that I think does love me unconditionally, and she was with me through all of that. And my dad could be certainly emotionally abusive, but he could also be physically abusive, Anne-Marie, and Mom took the bulk of that. Now, we kids got some of it, but Mom took the bulk of it, and her job was really keeping the peace and trying to keep the peace, and him stable and us over here. And And I think for a lot of years, I adore my mom, and writing this book made me realize what a wonderful and special woman she is. For a lot of years, I think I had a resentment because mom was the person keeping the peace. And I can't tell you how many times I just wanted to get in dad's face and just hit him. I wanted to take up for us. I wanted to stop this insanity that he seemed to perpetuate on all of us all the time. And I'll be honest, I kind of resented mom because she would never let me do it. She would never let me stand up to him, because now as an adult, I understand why. That conflict, God knows what would come of it, and just keeping the peace. And I struggled with that.
Well, as an adult child of an alcoholic myself, my mother was the one that sort of held things together, and I had that anger. We always get angry at the safe parent, right?
Yeah, right.
Because we know they're not going to hurt us.
Right.
We always get angry at the safe. So my relationship with my mother was very tumultuous throughout my life. And my relationship with my dad was much more peaceful. And also too, he really did made amends. And so I have no heart, yeah, my childhood sucked, but from 18 and 20 on, he was fine and made a real lot of amends and was a beloved grandfather by my children. I think that a lot of adult children of alcoholics, often the parent that is the safe one, the parent that was there all the time, gets the brunt of our anger and our feelings, because we know they won't abandon us.
That's exactly right. And that's how it was with my mom. And I think I had 3 younger sisters also. And, I think they probably said, why don't you just leave him to my mom a million times? And she never did. And I don't, I just know mom didn't think that she could make it with 4 kids without him. And
well, it's also a different time. And also too, I only for example, work with women coming out later in life, because I have to go through the layer of what the church has done to women before I can even get to our queerness.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times your mom received all those messages that you received. And if you come from an evangelical conservative tradition as a woman, your job is to keep your family together and make your husband happy. That is your job. And so just like we bought into the messages about, sexuality, your mom bought into some messages
He sure did.
about what you're supposed to do. And until you're I do feel like being queer or being gay is a gift, because I didn't come out till 50. So I'm way after you. And I think that it's a real gift, because I really did look through the world in a very heteronormative lens. And then when I came out, my lens changed. And the way I look at the entire world is a lot different than it did. Even though I considered myself progressive and a feminist and all that before I came out, my lens has changed completely, and so I'm able to have so much more compassion for my parents, because they struggled under the same systems that I had to navigate to find myself.
And that's absolutely true. And Anne-Marie, you say something that I totally agree with. A couple of things. How lucky we are to be queer, because of the perspective that we can bring to people. What a gift we have in being able to help others because of our queer experiences and because of how we struggled. And I have to tell you, and I say this sometimes too, and I said, I was just telling my law partner earlier today. I said, I just wish everybody was an alcoholic and addict and in recovery, because the benefits we get to have in 12-step groups.
Absolutely. You really do. I've done a lot of Al-Anon, so you do get a lot of benefits from it.
You just walk into a support structure that understands, that listens, that is empathetic, but yet will also challenge you on your own BS. And it's a real gift to have that. And to be recovering and queer is I almost feel special. You know what I mean? It's oh my goodness. And I love working with other people, because the ability to empathize and to understand, I think, is very strong. because the damage that, for many of us, as you've referenced, that we did to ourselves by having to live through that heteronormative lens for so long, and thinking of that as literally the gospel, I think it just kind of helps. It helps us help others, and I think that's the most important thing we can do.
I do. Let me ask you, so you wrote this book because you were still trying to untangle the very complicated relationship with your dad. Did it help?
Yeah, well, I can tell you.
How did it help?
Yeah, I can tell you unequivocally that by the time I concluded the process that was writing this book, it is without doubt, and I think what I was feeling, Anne-Marie, when I first started that writing so long ago, was I had not forgiven my dad, and it was depressing me, and it was like this albatross around my neck, and I knew from my recovery, I knew that I could not, that my sobriety would never be would never be safe unless I forgave the resentments and that I was holding on to. And the one with my dad was deep. So was the one with my mom. But I'd worked through that much easier, I think, than the one with my dad. And I can honestly say, by the time I completed this book, by the time it was done, I had forgiven Dad. And it was as if this great weight had been lifted off me. And so that was the greatest gift to me from this, is that forgiveness. And I honestly, Anne-Marie, I didn't realize how much that resentment toward Dad had been holding me back and impairing my sense of wholeness until I was able to get this book done. And it's been a wonderful experience,
Who should read your book?
Pardon?
Who should read your book?
Oh, I have to tell you, I think that I think
I haven't read it yet, but I will read it.
Yeah, I think anyone that is struggling with who they are, perhaps with their sexual orientation or their sense of self, should read the book. And I would like to think that parents should read this book, because the messages that I certainly received as a kid and as a young man, I recognize now I can't blame my parents. They were delivering to me what they had been taught and what they thought was right. And so, but I think that it would really benefit a lot of parents to read it, because somebody asked me once, they said, well, if your mom and dad would have come to you when you were 15 or 16, because my mom, when I came out to her, said that, we talked about you might being gay when you were 16.
Like your parents knew.
Yeah. And what if they would have come to you when you were 16 and said, we don't know, but if you are gay, we still love you. And I probably still would have denied it, but if I would have known that acceptance had been there and that love was going to be there, it could have been different. I mean, I don't know that to be the case, but I got to tell you, I sure would have loved that. It would have made things easier. And I like to think when parents offer up that unconditional love and willingness to listen and to learn, it is very meaningful to a child. And I would that would have been great.
I would love for you to go back and listen to my interview with John Silvic, because he wrote a book about, helping your LGBTQ adolescent. And I think you would really appreciate that. And John's gay man and is a psychologist, and great episode. And I think that, I think back to my parents. This is the thing, as a girl, sex was bad.
Yeah.
It just was bad. And so my mother was older when she had me. So she was what they call a Baltimore school Catholic, Baltimore catechism. I mean, she was like, she grew up in the 20s and 30s. And she just sex, any sex outside of marriage was wrong.
Yeah.
And so when I first slept with my first guy, when I was like 19 or 20, I had sex outside of marriage and it wasn't very great. But I just chalked it up because, oh, I just guess I must be guilty because I should be waited till I got married, And so like, and untangling all of that really became my life's work. And when I had children, I sort of forgot about it for a really long time. And then it was like in my 40s, when I became a minister, is when I started to untangle all the stuff with sexuality. And so it was a really long process for me, but it's okay. Like, I mean, like I have I have what I regret that I didn't have the experiences of being a young lesbian and falling in love and doing all those things when I was in my 20s,
Right.
and I was in my 50s before that happened. But I'm still very blessed and very happy that I was courageous enough to make all those changes that I needed to make to be able to live a life that feels right for me.
Anne Marie, there's a tremendous bravery. I mean, you think about it, you fit into your 50s before you begin, truly embracing yourself. That takes a bravery,
Well,
above and beyond.
well, and it's so funny too, because I was somebody like, so if someday we could talk offline, I could tell you all about the intricacies of the later in life community especially for women and men. I've worked with some men that have been in their 50s and come out and stuff like that. But one of the things is I didn't even realize how brave I was.
Yeah.
After, because I was somebody that came like, so a lot of women that come out later in life often have something called a catalyst, meaning they have a relationship with somebody and they realize they're not as straight as they thought they were be. But I wasn't one of those women. I came out without having a relationship with a woman. And being like, yeah, I think I gotta go. And my ex-husband, he was very aware of everything. And I was like, I think I gotta go explore this. And it was like something, and I had been a hospice chaplain for 7 years before. So it was like I knew that people died. When people were dying, they didn't regret the things they did. They regretted the things they didn't do. So I knew that if I needed to go and explore this part of myself because I didn't want to be on my deathbed saying I should have done that.
Yeah.
And that's when that's it. I thank all the thousands of hospice patients I saw over the years because they really taught me that life is to be explored and life is to be like, don't be afraid. Don't worry about all the ins and outs of everything. If something is truly calling you, whether it's your queerness or something else, you need to go and explore that. And as an older person now, totally get it.
And it's so true. It's like as you shared earlier, I'm married to a wonderful man, Anson, and even as I came out and got sober, I really struggled with relationships. I had never really learned to be emotionally intimate and physically intimate with the same person. I mean, sex represented sex, and that's what it was. And I was 47 before I had a relationship over 3 months, and God bless my husband. I mean, the patience that he has, and I'll tell you, it's so wonderful now. If we could have had this interview 10 years ago and I would have told you there's no way in heck I am resigned myself to, I'm just going to be alone. I'm not built for a relationship. But I just had to get some sobriety in and some emotional maturity in from being sober before I was capable of holding a relationship. And that just so happened to be in my late 40s when that happened. And I sometimes, think it takes what it takes, but he has given me that gift of exploring things I would never do. Oh, good God. I would have, talk about curmudgeon. I would have been a curmudgeon almost immediately, hitting my 50s, but I'm not now. And that's really been the greatest gift of sobriety and the greatest gift of accepting being a proud queer person is the people that I've met in our community and my husband and meeting people like you. I mean, it's like me being here with you today is a gift, and it's a gift of
Thank
being
you.
sober.
I'm
And
so excited. I'm going to order your book. We had a little, I'm just going to tell the listeners, we had a little communication problem. So I didn't that has nothing to do with Tate, but we had a little bit of a communication problem about this call today. And so I didn't have an opportunity to read the book. And so now I'm like dying to go read it. So I'll go get that after I get off the call, or you can send me one. So Tate, did you have a coming out song?
I do. Man in the Mirror by Michael Jackson. That was my coming out song. That came out in like 87, 88, and I had not come out yet. But when I finally started telling people that we had entered the era of CDs, we were out of cassettes and into CDs at this point in time. So we're talking 93-ish. So I bought that album, that CD, and I would play Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror over and over and over again. I still play it whenever I'm feeling down and I'm coming to work. I'll hit that in the string selection, and then I'll just jam to Man in the
That's like the song This Is Me from Greatest Showman.
Yeah.
That was really popular. And I'm also, my wife jokes that there's a gay man dying to get out of Broadway. I love Broadway. And so like my wife and I have a group of 5 guys that we're really good friends with, and one of them's her cousin, and we call them the gay mafia. And we text all the time and stuff like that. And like she doesn't get any of their Broadway references, but I get them. I'm very proud of that. Have you read what book or movie or film that really changed your perspective on things?
I'll tell you the one that changed my perspective on things, and I had come out and I was wrestling with this, but Saving Private Ryan is a military movie, and it's kind of a war movie.
It is a war movie.
And yeah, it's a war movie, but the deep sense of loss of that mom, when her sons had died, and then watching these people make a sacrifice to bring her one remaining son home. And I thought, if people can be so brave to save one person, I can be brave enough to tell the truth. And the movie just hit me that way. It may not hit a lot of people that way, but it hit me that way. And that I can at least be brave enough to be honest with those around me about who I am and what I am, and make a sincere attempt to be the best possible person that I can be. And that movie just hit me that way.
You were just at that point in your life when you saw that and you could really relate to
right.
what you're saying. Yeah, I can see that. How do you describe your life today?
I got to tell you, I describe my life as totally blessed in so many ways. In that I have a husband that I adore and that I love, a little dog that's a diva that dominates our life and our household that we both adore. I have friends that love and accept me, and and I'm honest. I guess that's really the truth. I'm honest, Anne Marie, and that's what I love most about my life. And I'm not afraid of being honest anymore. And I'm really not afraid of what anyone thinks. I have to speak the truth and my truth, and I can do it in a way where I'm that can help me and help others. And so I'm very relaxed in my life now, and I don't know any other way to describe it well.
I love that word though, relaxed. Yeah, that's a great word. So Tate Barkley, Sunday Dinners, Moonshine and Men. Where can people find this book?
You can find the book, find it wherever books are sold, but of course it's available on bookshop.org. If you like to buy your books online from independent bookstores, it's available on Amazon if that's easier, and on Barnes and Noble, powellbooks.com, all those places. So in any bookstore, if they're not carrying it, they can order it for you.
And do you do social at all?
I do. And I'm at Tate.Barkley on Instagram. And I'm on Tate Barkley on Facebook, and it's Tate Barkley on LinkedIn. Those are the three that I use.
Yeah, we do the same. I'm Amory Zanzel everywhere. I do the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Tate, I'm
if
sorry.
yeah, and if that's too much, you can go to just regular old TateBarkley.com and you can find out and it's all right there, along with an excerpt from the book. If you'd like to read it before you buy it, there's an excerpt right there that you can read and see if it's for you.
So I would love to thank you for such a great conversation today. I really enjoyed it a lot. I'm very excited to read your book. I hope it does wonders.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Coming Out and Beyond, LGBTQIA plus stories with Anne-Marie Zanzel. New episodes of the Coming Out and Beyond podcast drop every other Friday. You can tune in at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and at annemariezanzel.com. Be sure to hit subscribe when tuning in so you never miss an episode. And for more resources, articles, videos, and a free downloadable guide for coming out later in life, visit annemariezanzel.com.